All right, so we've all made bowls before. You take that log, you jam it into here, turns around, you try to make it round. Sometimes it hops around your shop and you chase it and you finally do it. And when you actually get the bowl, you've thrown away most of the wood and it's in chips on the floor. Now, admittedly, if you have a really nice piece of wood, a really great grain to it, it's well spalted, it's spectacular, that's the way you want to do it. Sometimes, if you want to spend the money and you have the system, you can core it and you get more than one bowl out of the log. But yeah, there's another way of making a bowl out of a very simple board with virtually no waste. So if you take a board, this is a fancy one, but any kind of board. I like to make them with some kind of design in it. And if I cut concentric rings out of this, and I cut the rings at an angle, then restack the rings, I get a bowl. That's what it's going to look like. All right, we are not going to make this bowl tonight, but I'm going to show you how to do it. If you take a very plain piece of wood, you make a nice bowl, but you can still make them somewhat fancy. I don't know, is there a camera that shows this? Yeah, good enough. Okay. So that was one of the first ones that I did. It was this one simple piece of wood. I just put walnut rings in between and a few other, minor pieces, and so you can make them look, much more interesting. So here is a board, which I've already started to do. Right? Just cut a bunch of concentric rings. You can see the angle. And then stack them together. And voila, you have a bowl. Simple. So I'm going to show you how to do this. We'll do a couple of rings. I'm not going to build a whole bowl tonight, but I am going to show you how to glue these together without using a stomper. Those of you who use stompers, good luck to you. I have some problems with that. I've got a better technique that is absolutely foolproof. So I'll show you how I glue each ring together. There's also what you have to remember when you do this is what angle are you going to cut this board? Well, there is a relationship between the thickness of the board that you use, the thickness of the ring, and the angle. And so if you change any of those, things start to change. So you have to be careful. So you have to calculate ahead of time if you want it to work just like this, so it's nice and smooth. You notice that I will have almost no lathe work to do on this, just some minor sanding. Well, I'm really cheating a little bit because for this particular one, I use something called a ring master, which calculates for you. If you look at, they have a table in their manual, and based on the thickness of the wood and how thick the walls of the bowl will be, it tells you exactly what angle. You can set this machine exactly right to within a fraction of a degree, and you get one will fit absolutely perfectly inside and out. And I'll show you that machine later. I won't demonstrate it because it takes too much time to actually set it up, but I'll show it to you and I'll show you roughly how it works. But for a little over $400 you can do that. Right? But I'm going to show you how to do it without that, manually. So let us begin. Okay. So the first problem you have, if you got this board and you got to figure out how to cut the rings. Well, if you go on YouTube and you look up the various methods that these so-called experts, because everyone on YouTube is an expert, does this, most of them show you how to do it this way. They say you take two boards, hold them together like this, draw your circles, draw the dimensions that you want, then go to your bandsaw, tilt the table on the bandsaw, cut out the rings, glue them together. Right? Well, I don't know if you've ever done that on a bandsaw. Some people find it very awkward to cut the bandsaw when the table isn't perfectly flat, right? But it works. The problem with that technique is you've got to glue them together, and that gives you another small error. Just cutting a board in half or taking two boards and getting together so that they're absolutely flat is also interesting. So if one of the tricks that you can do if you have a board and you're going to cut it, if I were to take a flat board and cut it with a table saw, when I glued it together, I would glue them together like this. That's because to hold the blade of the table saw rather absolutely vertical is almost impossible. Right? So if it's off a little bit, when you cut it, if you put them together like this, they will fit nice and flat. The other thing that I do, which really helps, is I have a piece of granite. It's about 2 feet by 18, 2 inches by 2 feet by 18 inches on my workbench all the time. It's absolutely flat. You can tell by just looking at reflections in it. When I glue things, I put them down flat on that flat surface and glue them together. It really helps keeping the one surface really smooth. I don't worry about the top surface because I may glue pieces together that are of different heights. I take scraps from my scrap bin and do this. I don't go out and buy wood. This stuff is expensive. You know, yet you do a project, you get all these little pieces all over the place. Oop. Where's my other piece? Oop. Right. These are all scrap pieces. I didn't buy any of this. I may have bought something a long time ago, but these are the leftovers. And I just run it through my thickness planer. So that's how I get the board. So this is one way to do it. It's actually simple. It works. The other way to do it is take your board and attach it to a backer board. So I make a backer board like this. It's out of MDF. Take a faceplate, glue it on, put this on the lathe. Right. And then what I used to do is take my board and use double-sided tape, you know, pressure-sensitive tape. And that does work. And every so often, the tape fails. And you've got to realign everything. All right. So I did this demo about 2 weeks ago at ART, and literally a few days before, I was on YouTube, and I saw this guy had a really great technique. He said, why don't you just drill the holes through your board and attach it permanently? All right. And it works. And it works so nicely. When you do that, make sure you do the inner smaller ring first. And when you do it, the thing just pops off. They won't break. It'll fall on the floor. Right? And they just come out one at a time. Right. We'll get there. All right. No. Okay. The other way of doing it is, again, with the bandsaw. If you have a nice small blade, just cut a tangent to the circle and just go around. But again, you have to do it at the right angle. Okay, so that works. Right. All right, so now I've got it all set. I'm going to put this on the lathe. And unfortunately, I just realized that this lathe is too smaller than my lathe. All right, so I have one that has a 12.5-inch swing. This one I think has, what about it, 10-inch swing? Yeah, I thought it had the 12 one. So this, unfortunately, is not going to work, and I'm not going to be able to actually make the ring, but I can do enough of it. That one has a drive thread that is larger than this one, and so that doesn't work. That's why we had to switch lathes, so I thought this would work. So that is unfortunate. However, let's assume that this is rotating. All right. Because I know you all have good imaginations. Pardon? Turn off the strobe light. And okay. I just take my parting tool. You come in at the right angle while it's spinning, and it just pops off. All right. All right. So when I first did this several years ago, I actually took my 45-degree triangle and drew with a magic marker a line right on the tool rest, and it worked. And because that was actually the way I did this one. So yeah, it does work. And I will show you when I talk about how you generate the angles appropriately, how much flexibility you have in doing that. So I made this really expensive, fancy, difficult to make jig. All right. And one for every angle that you may want to try. And this just conveniently sits right over here. And so you just, no, I hold it with my hand. All right. I make it just long enough so it's out of the way of this, so I'm not going to hit my knuckles most of the time. Like this. Okay. See? Oops. All right. And it works. And then for the next ring, just move this out. And so so you do it so that this, and you can adjust this so it's just about parallel. And it's more than accurate enough for most work. All right. So real simple. That's the easy part. Now let me tell you the minor problems with that. When you're trying to cut out the circle, you'd think that the kerf of the blade is all that you would be missing in here. But if you notice that there's a width to the parting tool, and so especially for the inner ring, yeah, it's going to be a little bit larger than you would like. Just know that that's going to happen. And so when you do, if you're trying to make a very exact calculation of what angle you should use to make this, yeah, you have to account for that. As you get into the larger diameter circles, it's not as important. Okay. All right. So now I have all of my rings. And the next step is to glue them. So I take the bottommost ring, glue it to a waste block, which I've already done because this is the bottommost ring. You all know how to center the bottommost ring to the waste block? Right. The easiest way to do that is you make your waste block, and take your live center. We have such good equipment in this organization, don't we? Here you go. And we know where the center is of the ring. Well, if you just put that in the center, put the glue on here, jam it against the waste block, let it set, and it's centered. Okay, so that's all I did with this. After I build the bowl, I'll just part this off. Okay. So let's say I just have the waste block on here, and I want to take the smallest ring, which is this here. This is actually two rings, but pretend it's the one ring, the smallest ring. And I want to glue it to the waste block. That is correct. All right. The reason that Mark asked that question is if you use the ring master to make the rings, and that one you actually do the largest ring first, but the way the board is attached to the ring master is through a thread in the center, so you have to make a hole in the center to clamp the board to the fixture for the ring master. I'll show you that later when we get when I show you the ring master. So I just put the glue on there. Bring this up like that. Tiny bit of pressure. Go have a cup of coffee. And it's done. All right. All right. So this is centered. So now I want to glue the wood glue. Type bond. Type bond. You know, okay. I want to show you exactly how fast tight bond sets up and when you should wait hours or a day and when you don't have to. All right? All right. An hour is actually more than enough. Okay. All right, so now I want to take the next ring. Oh, so I put the first ring on, and this is really neat because see how shallow it is? I can now take my gouge, bowl gouge, anything, and I can round the bottom out. Usually it's flat on the bottom, and you get this sharp delineation between the bottom and the side. Some people say, hey, that's fine. I like it to be a nice smooth transition. Well, I don't have to go in and do this 6, 7 inches or whatever size my bowl is. Do it now. Fix the outside if it's rough. And there's times when the outside will not be this smooth. Okay. All right. So then we want to put this on here. When you glue two pieces together for segmenting, those of you who have done a lot of segmenting understand this. Each surface must be absolutely flat and smooth. Right. Actually, 150 grit is actually more than enough. If you want to do 220, that's even better, but it's not a big deal. My board went through a thickness planer, so I know that both sides are flat. However, when you start to cut them, sometimes you get a tiny bit of tear out right at the edge. If there was glue around, you may have some glue. So you really want to just do a quick touch up. This is the way to touch this one up. As long as this is hollowed out or concave, just take your sandpaper. Done. This piece, however, is a little different. You can't do that. But because it was already flat, by hand, that's all that's necessary. All right. Yeah. Would anyone like to use their teeth on this one? No, if don't. I have other ways of doing it. Fair not. First of all, it always helps to keep the lathe clean, especially when it's not your lathe. So we will do that. If I had a stick, I would use it. That's right. Oops. By the glue. All right. Okay. Oh. Thank you. Okay. And you can line it up by hand so easily. Okay. However, okay. I'll answer that question in a second. Then before the glue actually sets up, I take a look at that outer ring and make sure that it really is round. It is concentric. Sometimes it slips a little bit. I have plenty of time. I could break that seal now and redo it and slide it around. And that's very important. There will be times when, and if you look at this closely, this does not actually line up perfectly with the previous ring. And we'll go into why I screwed that up, but it does happen. But I always do that check. And so even if one of the previous rings is off, you can get back on track and keep everything right. Okay. So I'm not sure I put enough glue in it. So before you spin it, what you really want to do is take that cloth and wipe it off, because the first time you spin it, you get glue up here on your face mask. Yeah. I brought my spare Prismace mag that doesn't have that little line on it. Yes. So, yeah. Okay. And so now is actually a good time to clean up the outside. So when you use the Ringmaster, you actually cut the angle from both directions, first one side then the other, and you're often left with a tiny ridge in the middle. So either with sandpaper or with one of the gougers, you can smooth that out. So I can now shape the outside. All right. And so in answer to your question, how long do I have to wait? I don't have to wait at all. Tiny bit of pressure over here. This isn't going to move now. Yeah. So how long have we waited? 5 minutes, if that? Absolutely. So right now, actually, this is on pretty tight. I could actually work on the inside. I'd probably put another ring or two on because, it's easy to do. Okay. All right. And you build your bowl that way. Right. And then when you take it off, what I do is then I will shape the bottom a little bit. So I don't like it to go with a flat bottom. I like to make it a little bit round. And you see I've made an attempt to do that here. So it helps, and then later on you can actually redo the bottom if you want to, turn it around and use a cold jaws or some other way or a jam chuck or something and finish up the bottom. But yes, you can do a lot of it right on the lathe. So that's how to do it. So you're going to end up with this really ugly, straight-sided, bland bowl. And as my wife said, that's not a bowl, that's a flower pot. I said, it's a bowl. You don't understand. You're not a wood turner. That's not a definition. Close to divorce. Close to divorce. I finally said, you are absolutely right. This is only for the demonstration. Only for the demonstration. Okay. All right. So now I have my flower pot, which is really ugly. However, I can make it look a lot nicer by if I put a contrasting color in between each layer, it would enhance this so much. You'd have these nice little rings. It would make a dull, ugly flower pot look a lot nicer. So if there was a strong grain to this, yes, you want to do that. And so when you dry fit these, before you dry fit it, oops, right, line these up the way you want and draw an index line. And then you can do that. All right. All right. So that's one way of enhancing it. The other way is to make another kind of feature ring. Oops. It's really wherever your imagination takes you as to how you want to decorate this thing. And so I had this idea. I wanted like bunting. I wanted to be all around, but I wanted to come together, meet in every intersection. And this one was so simple to do. So I have a disc sander, and I put this on the plate of the disc sander. And first of all, I drew the 8 points, and I went like this. All around. I had all these flats, took a piece of walnut contrasting color, glued it on each one of these things, and then put it on the lathe and then turned it around. It was really simple to do. Okay. Neat? Yeah. See? Some people say, yeah. Some people say, oh, that's a good idea. But then I said, really, and I really wanted ribbons and not this full bunting. So I did it again. And I'll just show you one example. I didn't do the whole ring, but you can see you can't do it. Do the same thing in reverse. You do the exact same thing, but just take a little bit less off and put different color back in. So you can do that. You can put stripes in your board. And again, when you put this thing together, you can decide how you want those stripes to be oriented. So I'm not going to try to make a pattern out of this. Those of you who have seen my coffee mug, you notice I do this little twisted pattern. So you can do that. This one, which I was going to demonstrate, that doesn't fit on this particular lathe. This is maple, and this is cherry, and so I have 8 intersecting boards in there. And so when I put this together, each of the rings will be rotated just a little bit, and I can decide how much I want to do that when it's dry before I actually glue it together. And it gives you another different idea as to how to do this. It's really wherever your imagination takes you. Or you do something that's totally random, and you get something like that. When you glue these together, I showed you how to make them absolutely flat. Well, it really depends on how crazy you want to be. This was from another project, but if you look at this side here, and I'll pass this around, those 3 surfaces really are good. Right? If you look at this particular one on the dull side, you'll see that these didn't quite come together. I would not use this one, but there is a way of filling that in. All right? So this side actually looks a lot better. It was one of the sides I think wasn't cut perfectly perpendicular. So I've got this tiny gap over here. I'll pass this around, you'll be able to see it. So how do you fill a tiny gap to make it look better? Well, we know we just take sawdust, rub it in there with a little glue, right? Can you get sawdust in that tiny crack? No. So how are you going to get sawdust? Well, I realized when I was doing this that if I take that type of whichever one, so in this particular case I've got cherry here and maple here, so I've got to decide which one I want to use as the filler. If I do this for about 30 seconds, and if you look on here, you have the finest powder of that material that you've ever made. It's like sow talcum powder, right? So, pardon? I think this is 220, something like that. So, again, shake it down, put it in that crack like that, put a little tight bond on top, rub it in a little bit, sand it down, and gets you out of a lot of trouble in those cases. Sometimes it's so bad, yeah, you don't want to do that. But yes, it will make it a lot better, and it's another way of hiding. In this, that's the way I do it, yeah. Because what I like the wood to be in there, not the glue to be in there. All right? But then you really mush it right. If it's a big gap, yeah, you sort of mix it up a lot more, but it's that top surface that's most important because that's what everyone is going to see. All right? So, yeah. That's it. If it's tiny like this, CA would work. I'm not going to rub CA with my fingers like that because I'll walk around like this for the next 3 weeks, which has happened. So yeah, I prefer the type. There are other times I would use CA glue, but CA glue is going to dry clear. And so with the CA glue, you'd actually just drip the really thin CA glue in there. It would get absorbed into the sawdust, and then you just have to sand it smooth again. You just keep sanding. If you use the CA glue to fill those cracks, finish the surface first. Because if you don't, all the spillover from the CA glue, you're saying, yeah, it's happened to you, Mark, right? Will stain the area around here. If you come back and make everything really glossy like I like, yeah, it'll blend in and you probably won't see it. But it's best if you do it first and then it doesn't absorb, and then when you sand it, yeah, you don't have that problem. Okay. Right. So I showed you how to make this straight bowl. You can make round bowls like this. Okay. This is here just so that it doesn't fall apart while I show it to you. This is a stomper, but I don't like to. I'd rather do it the way I did it. Okay. And so you notice that I can make outside curves or inside curves, right, using the same technique. However, because these rings here are so close in diameter, you can't do it from one board. You actually need several boards to do that. And so in that case, I would take two boards like this. I would glue them together. Oops, and make 3 or 4 boards out of it. And so I would then have to figure out which boards would be for which rings. And in order to do that, you sketch out your design. Is this better? Oh, is this better? Okay. So sketch out your design, draw tangents to each ring. You can see I've got the rings here, right? And then figure out, based on what the diameters are, which boards you need for which rings. And you notice in this one I've labeled the rings, the boards A, B, C, and D, and then so I've got a D1 and a D2. I can get those 2 rings out of one board, right? But I cannot get D1 and A1 out of the same board. Right? So yes, you do have to do some figuring and calculating. So the last step we have to worry about is how we actually do that calculation. Well, the ringmaster, which I do promise to at least show you a little bit of roughly how it works, does have tables in their manual. So for a given thickness of the board and for a nominal 1/4 inch thickness for your bowl, they will tell you what angle you have to set their machine. Okay. For those of you who don't want to spend over $400 for that manual and the associated machine, you draw it out. Right? I'm not going to give you any mathematical formulas for it. For this, some people like the math, some people don't. But if you were to draw a to scale, right? So this is my board, and let's assume that I'm going to cut this at 45 degrees. So I'm going to make a bunch of slits. Okay. So this board here will fit. If I take this board and physically were to move it up here, it becomes this board. So that this point gets moved up to here. This point gets moved up to here, then that board becomes here. Right? So for a 3/4 inch board, 45 degrees, 3/4 inch width rings, you see that these will line up absolutely perfectly. And so I have no waste at all, and when I'm on the lathe, I have almost no work to do. However, I forgot something on this, the kerf of the blade. Remember, I told you that's a problem. So you have to modify this by the kerf. So on this, you actually have to draw an extra line over here and an extra line over here. So the actual width of this is going to be smaller. And so when you do that, let's see. When you do that, and you do that translation, depending upon the amount of overlap that you get, the amount of that kerf, you will either get pieces like this, which are little jaggies, all right? And so the actual width of the wall, instead of being this, will now be a bit smaller because you'd actually figure you can draw a line from there to there, etc. Right? So you just kind of have to account for it. Right. If you make the rings too small together, all right, then you get very small overlap, and your walls are going to be really thin, right? Which may or may not work. Depends on how accurate everything is. Right? If you make it really thin, you get no overlap at all. So you can do this for different angles, and then you can manually see what is going to work for you. Okay? Does that make some sense? Right. This picture here will show you that, showing you the actual kerf as well. Here. Right. And so if you have, for this was taken out of the manual, and so for the particular angle of 30 degrees for that spacing and that kerf, 3/4 inch board, it comes out perfect. Pardon? Does that make it better? All right, I got it. Okay. Okay. All right. So again, there's a relationship between the angle that you cut each ring, the thickness of the board, and the resulting width or thickness of the final bowl. Right? So you always have to keep that in mind. So if you're going to do it manually, draw it out. It's the safest way to do it. Simple rule of thumb: 3/4 inch board that's dimensional lumber. You can buy it at Lowe's, Home Depot, something like that. If you space the rings, or the index the rings 1 inch, and you have a wide parting tool, it'll come pretty close. If you do it a really thin parting tool, you're super careful, 30 degrees will give you a slightly better one. So somewhere between 30 and 45 degrees will give you enough overlap so that you can do these things. Okay, make sense? So this is the ringmaster. It clamps to the bed of your lathe. If you purchase a ringmaster from Ringmaster rather than from your friend who is trying to get rid of his old equipment, they will ask you what lathe you have, because this unit here, this base, which is the guts of it, is sized to your lathe. So this is sized to my lathe, which has a 12.5 inch swing to it. It will not work on this lathe because the cutters will not be dead center. Right, so you do have to be careful of that. And I tell you that quite painfully because I did buy this from a friend of mine and he had a larger lathe, so I ended up having to buy another one of these. So it cost me another $200, but it was still a bargain. So that's fine. It's fine. Okay, so. Oops. No, I still have it. Anyone who needs one, I can come up with a fairly good deal with you for you. Or someday I'm actually going to get a big lathe. I think he had this standard 16-inch one. Yeah. 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 No, I'm just so it doesn't really fall on the floor. Okay. So this actually, there's some clamps that bolt this nice and tight. You loosen up this bolt. This will rotate to appropriate angle. There's a guide on this side here, which I think you can see with the overhead projector. All right. So there are some angles here. The manual actually calculates the angle for you to literally tenths of a degree. They want you to be that accurate. And so you make your first cut, and you see how it fits. And if there's a slight jaggy on one side or the other, it tells you whether to increase the angle or decrease the angle slightly. If you want to be absolutely anal about it, they developed the Ringmaster as a semi-production machine, so you get a lot of good reproducibility in order to make lots of them over and over and over again. Right? And so you can cut them perfectly. In the manual, it also tells you how to make them with a double wall thickness, if you want. Remember we talked about the width of the rings? What they use is an indexing mechanism, and that's what this arm is here. There's a little pin that goes through these holes, right? And so you can index the cutters exactly, so you can have nice thin-walled, many thin rings and have some really interesting designs. So it is really nice if you want to make complicated devices, complicated bowls and shapes, things like that. That works out well. It will also tell you how to make inside and outside curves and change the angle as you go, like that vase that I showed you. And it's really quite simple to do. I can't go through all the details. You just got to follow the manual. I will tell you that if you pick up a used one and you look at the used manual and they are free online, they're almost impossible to understand what he's really trying to say. I read it about 6 or 7 times before I figured out how to use it. There is a learning curve to using this. So the first time you do it, don't use expensive wood. Don't try to make something exotic like I did my first try. They say that they have a new manual, which is a lot better, but they want $50 for it. And I said, just for the manual, I said, nah, I'll just suffer with this for as many times as I am going to use it. So this is the ringmaster. What the ringmaster does, you see these cutters over here. I don't know if you can see that. Do we see that in the overhead? All right, so these cutters, you notice they are really very, very narrow, so you don't have that problem that we have with the wider parting tools. And if you looked at the ends of these, you would notice that they're tapered slightly, so that minimizes the widening of the curve of that space. And so that part is nicely designed. So you cut from one direction, and then you cut from the other direction. And when these get dull, you take these out, you turn them around, and you use the other side. And then when those get dull, then you have to resharpen them, which is really a simple thing to do. You can get them either way from them. They sell both kinds. They sell a lot of accessories now. Just go on ringmaster.com or some appropriate, I think that's what it is, and then you can find out all the details. So if you do a lot of bowls like this and a lot of interesting shapes, yeah, it might be worth it. It's a lot of fun to use. If you're only going to try it once, do the manual method. Try the manual method first. Get a good feeling for it before you spend the $400. For those of you who belong to ART at Open Turning, on the 12th of March, I will have this there actually all set up on a lathe, and we will be able to practice and actually make a bunch of rings where we can adjust angles and stuff and see actually how it works, and you can play with it. And if you don't belong to ART, for $30 a year, you can belong to ART and you can come join us. If enough people are interested in this sort of thing, at some point we could actually set this up as a mini workshop sometime. When we have that one in June 17th, there's a possibility, I don't know. We just have to find someone that would have a lathe that this would fit to. And we could do that, and then you could have some hands-on experience doing it. So I think I can't actually make the rings for you, unfortunately, because it's the wrong lathe. But the only other thing I will show you is that this is also part of the ringmaster. This actually goes on here. And what this does, it puts your board out here. And the reason for that is so you can get behind it with the mechanism. You need this space over here. But you notice that just have a thread here, so you drill a 1/2-inch hole in the center of the board, put it on here, you lock it on with these washers, and that's the way it's held on. And so when the bowl is all finished, yes, you've got to make a plug to plug the bottom. On something like this, it would be easy to do. Just take the contrasting color, make a little plug, and it would actually be part of the design. But you notice I didn't do it with this one. I did do this with the ringmaster because I figured out a little trick that might work, which did work actually. So instead of this long tube, this is for that size lathe. Actually, I do have an adapter that goes from this to this. And I either hot glue or glue the board to this. And this actually does the same thing. It brings me away from the headstock. And when I part this off enough times and mess this up, I'll just have to make another one and glue this back on. So you can do it without having to drill the hole in the middle. Just use this as the mount instead of that long cylinder from I think that's all I can tell you tonight.